Old Polyakov arranged for Klimov, the scout, to take him at night to regimental HQ. He wanted to find out how things were with Seryozha. "That's a splendid idea, old man," said Grekov. "You can have a bit of a rest, then come back and tell us how things are in the rear." "You mean with Katya?" asked Polyakov, guessing why Grekov had been so quick to agree. "Oh, they left HQ long ago," said Klimov. "The commander had them both sent to the left bank. By now they've probably already visited the registry office in Aktuba." "Do you want to cancel our trip then?" asked Polyakov pointedly. Grekov looked at him sharply, but all he said was, "Very well then, be off with you." Very well, thought Polyakov. They set off down the narrow passage about 4 in the morning. Polyakov kept bumping his head against the supports and cursing Seryozha. He felt a little angry and embarrassed at the strength of his affection for the boy. After a while the passage widened. They sat down for a rest. And Klimov said jokingly, "What, haven't you got a present for them?" "Oh, to hell with the damn boy," said Polyakov. "I should have taken a brick so I could give him a good knock on the head." "I see," said Klimov. "That's why you wanted to come with me. That's why you're ready to swim the Volga to see him. Or is it Katya you want to see? Are you dying of jealousy?" "Come on," said Polyakov. "Let's get going." Soon they came to the surface and had to walk through no man's land. It was utterly silent. Perhaps the war's come to an end, thought Polyakov. He could picture his own home with an extraordinary vividness. There was a plate of borscht on the table, and his wife was gutting a fish he had caught. He even began to feel quite warm. That night, General Paulus gave orders for the attack on the tractor factory. 2 infantry divisions were to advance through the breach opened by bombers, artillery and tanks. Since midnight, cigarettes had been glowing in the soldiers' cupped hands. The first Junkers flew over the factory an hour and a half before dawn. The ensuing bombardment was quite without respite. Any gap in the unbroken wall of noise was immediately filled by the whistle of bombs tearing towards the earth with all their iron strength. The continuous roar was enough to shatter your skull or your backbone. It began to get light, but not over the factory. It was as though the earth itself were belching out black dust, smoke, thunder, lightning. The brunt of the attack was borne by Beryozkin's regiment and House 6-1. All over that sector, half-deafened men leapt drunkenly to their feet, dimly realizing that this time the Germans really had gone berserk. Caught in no man's land, Klimov and Polyakov rushed towards some large craters made by 1-ton bombs at the end of September. Some soldiers from Podchuvarov's battalion had escaped from their caved-in trenches and were running in the same direction. The Russian and German trenches were so close together that part of the bombardment fell on the German assault troops waiting in the front line. To Polyakov, it was as though a fierce wind from downstream was sweeping up the Volga. Several times he was knocked off his feet. He fell to the ground, no longer knowing what world he lived in, whether he was old or young, what was up and what was down. But Klimov dragged him along, and finally they slid to the bottom of a huge crater. Here the darkness was threefold: the darkness of night, the darkness of dust and smoke, the darkness of a deep pit. They lay there beside one another. The same soft light, the same prayer for life filled both their heads. It was the same light, the same touching hope that glows in all heads and all hearts, in those of birds and animals, as well as in those of human beings. Klimov couldn't stop swearing at Seryozha, still somehow thinking this was all his fault. Deep down, though, he felt he was praying. This explosion of violence seemed too extreme to continue for long, but there was no let-up. As time went by, the black cloud only thickened, linking the earth and the sky still more closely. Klimov found the roughened hand of the old man and squeezed it. Its answering warmth gave him a brief moment of comfort. An explosion nearby threw a shower of earth, stone and brick into the crater. Polyakov was hit in the back by fragments of brick. It was even worse when great chunks of earth began peeling off the walls. There they were, cowering in a pit. They'd never again see the light of day. Soon the Germans up above would cover them over with earth, then level the edges of the tomb. Usually Klimov preferred to go on reconnaissance missions alone. He'd hurry off into the darkness like an experienced swimmer striking out into the open sea. Now, though, he was glad to have Polyakov beside him. Time no longer flowed evenly. It had gone insane, tearing forward like a shock wave, then suddenly congealing, turning back on itself, like the horns of a ram. Finally, though, the men in the pit raised their heads. The dust and smoke had been carried away by the wind, and they could see a dim light. The earth quietened. The continual roar separated out into a series of distinct explosions. They felt a numb exhaustion, as though every feeling except anguish had been crushed out of their souls. As Klimov staggered to his feet, he saw a German soldier lying beside him. Battered, covered in dust, he looked as though he had been chewed up by the war from the peak of his cap to the toes of his boots. Klimov had no fear of Germans. He had an unshakable confidence in his own strength, his own miraculous ability to pull a trigger, throw a grenade, strike a blow with a knife or a rifle butt a second earlier than his opponent. Now, though, he didn't know what to do. He was amazed at the thought that, blinded and deafened as he was, he had been comforted by the presence of this German, had mistaken his hand for Polyakov's. Klimov and the German looked at one another. Each had been crushed by the same terrible force, and each was equally helpless to struggle against it. They looked at one another in silence, two inhabitants of the war. The perfect, faultless, automatic reflex they both possessed, the instinct to kill, failed to function. Polyakov, a little further away, was also gazing at the stubble-covered face of the German. He didn't say anything either, though he usually found it difficult to keep his mouth shut. Life was terrible. It was as though they could understand, as though they could read in one another's eyes, that the power which had ground them into the mud would continue, even after the war, to oppress both conquered and conquerors. As though coming to an unspoken agreement, they began to climb to the surface, all three of them, easy targets, all three of them quite sure they were safe. Polyakov slipped. The German, who was right beside him, didn't give him a hand. The old man tumbled down to the bottom, cursing the light of day, but obstinately crawling back up towards it. Klimov and the German reached the surface. They both looked round, one to the east, one to the west, to see if any of their superiors had noticed them climbing quite peaceably out of the same pit. And then, without looking back, without a word of goodbye, they set off for their respective trenches, making their way through the newly ploughed, still smoking hills and valleys. "The house has gone. It's been razed to the ground," said Klimov in a frightened voice, as Polyakov hurried after him. "Oh, my brothers, have you all been killed?" Then the artillery and machine guns opened fire, and the German infantry began to advance. This was to be the hardest day that Stalingrad had known. "It's all because of that damned Seriotcha," muttered Polyakov. He was unable to understand what had happened, to grasp that there was now no one left in House 6-1. Klimov's cries and sobs merely irritated him. During the initial air attack, a bomb had fallen on top of the underground pipeline that housed one of Berezovsky's battalion command posts. Berezovsky himself, battalion commander Durkin, and the telephonist had been trapped. Finding himself in complete darkness, deafened and choking with dust, Berezovsky had thought he was no longer in the land of the living. Then, in a brief moment of silence, Durkin had sneezed and asked, "Are you alive, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel?" "Yes," Berezovsky had answered. On hearing his commander's voice, Durkin had recovered his customary good humour. "Well then, everything's fine," he said, hawking and spitting. In fact, things seemed far from fine. Durkin and the telephonist were up to their necks in rubble. It was impossible for them even to check whether they had any broken bones. An iron girder above them prevented them from straightening their backs. It was this girder, however, that had saved their lives. Durkin turned on his torch for a moment, and what he saw was quite terrifying. There were large slabs of stone hanging right over their heads, together with twisted pieces of iron, slabs of buckled concrete covered in oil, and hacked up cables. One more bomb and all this would crash down on top of them. For a while they huddled in silence, listening to the furious force hammering at the workshops above. Even posthumously, these workshops continued to work for the defence, thought Byroskin. It was difficult to destroy iron and reinforced concrete. Then they examined the walls. There was clearly no way they could get out by themselves. The telephone was intact, but silent. The line must have been cut. It was also almost impossible to talk. They were coughing constantly, and their voices were drowned by the roar of explosions. Though it was less than 24 hours since he had been in delirium, Byroskin now felt full of strength. In battle, his strength imposed itself on all his subordinates. Nevertheless, there was nothing essentially military or warlike about it. It was a simple, reasonable, and very human strength. Few men were able to display strength of this kind in the inferno of battle. They were the true masters of the war. The bombardment died down. It was replaced by an iron rumble. Byroskin wiped his nose, coughed, and said, "And now the wolves are howling. Their tanks are attacking the tractor factory, and we're right in their path." Perhaps because he couldn't imagine anything worse, Durkin began singing a song from a film. In a loud voice he half sang, half coughed. "What a beautiful life we lead! What a beautiful life! Things can never go wrong with such a wonderful chief." The telephonist thought Durkin had gone mad. All the same, coughing and spitting, he joined in. "She'll grieve for me, she says she'll grieve for me all her life. But soon another man will make her his wife." Meanwhile, up in the workshop, filled with dust, smoke, and the roar of tanks, Glushkov was tearing the skin off his hands and fingers as he rooted up slabs of stone, iron, and concrete. He was in a state of frenzy. Only this allowed him to clear away heavy girders it would normally have taken 10 men even to shift. The rumble of tanks, the shell bursts, the chatter of machine guns grew still louder, and Byroskin could see light again. It was a dust-laden, smoky light, but it was the light of day. Looking at it, Byroskin thought, "See, Tamara? You needn't have worried. I told you it wouldn't be anything terrible." Then Glushkov embraced him with his powerful, muscular arms. Gesturing around him, his voice choked with sobs, Durkin cried out, "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, I'm in command of a dead battalion, and Vanya's dead. Our Vanya's dead." He pointed to the corpse of the battalion commissar. He was lying on its side in a dark crimson puddle of blood and machine oil. The regimental command post was relatively unscathed. There was just a dusting of earth on the bed and the table. Pivovarov leapt up, swearing happily, as Byroskin came in. Byroskin immediately began questioning him. "Are we still in touch with the battalions? What about the encircled house? How's Pochufarov? Durkin and I got caught in a mousetrap. We couldn't see and we lost touch with everyone. I don't know who's dead and who's alive. Where are the Germans? Where are our men? I'm completely out of touch. We've just been singing songs. Quick, give me a report." Pivovarov began by telling him the number of casualties. Everyone in House 6-1, including the notorious Grekov, had perished. Only the scout and one old militiaman had escaped. But the regiment had withstood the German assault. The men still alive were still alive. The telephone rang. From the signaler's face, they all realized it was Churkov himself. Byroskin took the receiver. It was a good line. The men in the suddenly quiet bunker recognized Churkov's low, serious voice. Byroskin, the divisional commander's wounded. His second-in-command and chief of staff are dead. I order you to take command yourself. Then more slowly and with emphasis, you held their attack. You commanded the regiment through hellish, unheard-of conditions. Thank you, my friend. I embrace you, and I wish you luck. In the workshops of the tractor factory, the battle had only just begun. Those who were alive were still alive. House 6-1 was now silent. Not one shot could be heard from the ruins. It had evidently borne the brunt of the air attack. The remaining walls had now collapsed, and the stone mound had been flattened. The German tanks, firing at Podchuvarov's battalion, were screened by the last remains of the building. What had once been a terrible danger to the Germans was now a place of refuge. From a distance, the heaps of red brick seemed like chunks of raw, steaming flesh. Grey-green German soldiers were buzzing excitedly around the dead building. "We must take command of the regiment," said Byroskin to Pivovarov. "Until today my superiors have never been satisfied with me. Then, after sitting around all day singing songs, I get Churkov's thanks and the command of a division. Well, I won't let you off the hook now." But the Germans were pressing forward. This was no time for pleasantries. It was very cold when Victor, Lyudmila, and Nadia arrived in Moscow. Snow was falling. Alexandra Vladimirovna was sitting still in Kazan. Victor had promised to get her a job at the Karpov Institute, but she had wanted to stay on at the factory. These were strange days, days of both joy and anxiety. The Germans still seemed powerful and threatening, as though they were preparing some new offensive. There was no doubt, or a sign, that the war had reached a turning point. Nevertheless, everyone wanted to return to Moscow. It seemed right and natural, as did the government's decision to send back various institutions that had been evacuated. People could sense that spring was in the air, that the worst days of the war were over. Nevertheless, the capital seemed sullen and gloomy during this second winter of the war. Heaps of dirty snow covered the pavements. The outskirts of the city were just like the country. There were little paths linking each house with tram stops and food stores. You often saw the iron pipes of makeshift stoves smoking away through a window. The walls of these buildings were covered in a frozen layer of yellow soot. In their short sheepskin coats and scarves, the Muscovites looked very provincial, almost like peasants. On the way from the station, Victor looked round at Nadia's frowning face. They were both perched on top of their baggage in the back of a truck. "So, mademoiselle," he said, "this isn't the Moscow you dreamed of when we were in Kazan." Annoyed that Victor had guessed her feelings, Nadia didn't answer. And Victor began to hold forth. "Man never understands that the cities he's built are not an integral part of nature. If he wants to defend his culture from wolves and snowstorms, if he wants to save it from being strangled by weeds, he must keep his broom, spade and rifle always at hand. If he goes to sleep, if he thinks about something else for a year or two, then everything's lost. The wolves come out of the forest, the thistles spread, and everything's buried under dust and snow. Just think how many great capitals have succumbed to dust, snow, and couch grass." Victor suddenly wanted Lyudmila, who was in the cab with the driver, to have the benefit of his reflections too. He leant over the side of the truck and asked, through the half-open window, "Are you comfortable, Lyuda?" "What's all this about the death of cultures?" asked Nadia. "It's just that the janitors haven't been clearing away the snow." "Ah, don't be silly," said Victor. "Just look at that ice." The truck gave a sudden jolt. The bundles and suitcases flew up into the air. and together with Nadia and Victor. They looked at each other and burst out laughing. How strange it all was. How could he ever have guessed that he would do his most important work in Kazan, during a war, with all the suffering and homelessness that entailed? He had expected them to feel only a solemn excitement as they drew near to Moscow. He had expected their sorrow over Tolya, Marussia, and Anna Semyonovna. Their thoughts of the victims claimed almost every family, to blend with the joy of homecoming and fill their souls. But it hadn't been like that at all. On the train, Victor had been upset by all kinds of trivia. He'd even been annoyed with Lyudmila for sleeping so much, instead of looking out over the earth that her own son had defended. She had snored very loudly. A wounded soldier passing in the corridor had heard her and exclaimed, "Oh, there's a true soldier of the guard." He had been equally annoyed with Nadia. She had chosen all the most delicious-looking biscuits out of the bag and left her mother to clear up the remains of her meal. She had put on an absurd, mocking tone of voice whenever she spoke to him. He had overheard her in the next compartment saying, "My father's a great admirer of music. Sometimes he even tinkles on the piano himself." The people they had shared with the compartment with talked about such matters as central heating and the Moscow sewers, about people who had gaily neglected to pay their rent and so lost their right to live in Moscow, about what were the best foodstuffs to bring with them. Victor didn't like these conversations, but in the end, he too was talking about janitors and water pipes. When he couldn't sleep at night, he wondered if the telephone had been cut off, and remembered that he must get ration cards for the academy store. The bad-tempered woman in charge of the coach had found a chicken bone under Victor's seat when she was sweeping out the compartment. "What pigs," she had muttered, "and they think of themselves as intelligentsia." At Murom, Victor and Nadia had gone for a walk along the platform and run into some young men wearing long coats with astrakhan fur collars. One of them had looked round and said, "Look, old Father Abraham's coming back from evacuation." "Yes," laughed the other, "he wants to get his medal for the defence of Moscow." At Kanash, they had stopped opposite a train full of prisoners. Pressing their pale faces against the tiny barred windows, the prisoners had shouted, "Tobacco!" or "Give us a smoke!" The sentries patrolling up and down the train had cursed at the men as they pushed them away from the windows. In the evening, Victor had gone to the next coach to see the Sokolovs. Maria Ivanovna, a coloured shawl around her head, was getting her bedding ready. She was sleeping in the top bunk, and Pyotr Laventreevich down below. Worried about whether Pyotr would be comfortable, she answered Victor's questions quite randomly and forgot to ask about Lyudmila. Sokolov himself had just yawned and said how exhausting he found the heat. For some reason, Victor had been offended by this lukewarm welcome. "It's the first time in my life," he said, in an irritated tone that surprised even himself, "that I've seen a man sleep below and make his wife climb up on top." "It's what we always do," said Maria Ivanovna, kissing Sokolov on the temple. "Pyotr Laventreevich gets too hot up on top, but it's all the same to me." "Well," said Victor, "I'm off." The Sokolovs didn't ask him to stay, and once again he felt offended. It was very hot in the carriage that night. All kinds of memories had come back to him. Kazan, Karimov, Alexandra Vladimirovna, his conversations with Madyarov, his tiny office at the university. What a charming, anxious look had come into Maria Ivanovna's eyes when Victor had discussed politics at their evening gatherings. Very, very different from their preoccupied look just now. "Would you believe it," he said to himself, "taking the bottom bunk, where it's cool and comfortable. What a tyrant!" Then he got angry with kind, meek Maria Ivanovna, whom he liked more than any other woman he knew. "She's a little red-nosed rabbit." But then Pyotr Lavrentievich is a difficult man. He seems so gentle and measured, but really he's arrogant, secretive, and vindictive. Yes, the poor woman has a lot to put up with." Victor hadn't been able to get to sleep. He'd tried to imagine the reactions of Chepizin and his other friends. Many of them knew about his work already. How would it all go? What would Gurevich and Chepizin say? He was, after all, a conquering hero. Then he had remembered that Markov wouldn't be in Moscow for another week. He had made detailed arrangements for setting up the laboratory, and it would be impossible to start work without him. It was a pity that he and Sokolov were such theoreticians, that they had such clumsy, insensitive hands. Yes, a conquering hero. But somehow he hadn't been able to hold on to this train of thought. He kept seeing the prisoners begging for tobacco, and the young men who had called him Old Father Abraham. And then there was that strange remark of Postoev's. Sokolov had been talking about a young physicist called Landesman, and Postoev had said, "Who cares about Landesman now? Viktor Pavlovich has astonished the world with his discovery." And then he'd embraced Sokolov and said, "Still, what matters is that we're both Russians." Would the telephone and the gas be working? And had people thought about trivia like this 100 years ago on their way back to Moscow after the defeat of Napoleon? The truck came to a stop not far from their house. Once again, the Strum saw the front door, the 4 windows of their flat with the blue paper crosses that had been pasted on last summer, the linden trees on the edge of the pavement, the sign saying milk, and the board on the janitor's door. "Well, I don't suppose the lift will be working," said Lyudmila. She turned to the driver. "Can you help take our things up to the 2nd floor?" "Why not? You can pay me in bread." They unloaded the truck. Nadia stayed to watch over their things while Victor and Lyudmila went up to their apartment. They went up the stairs very slowly, somehow surprised that everything had changed so little. The letterboxes were still the same. The door on the 1st floor was still covered with a piece of black cloth. How strange that streets, houses, and things you forgot about didn't just disappear. They came back, and there you were in the midst of them again. Once, too impatient to wait for the lift, Tolia had run up to the 2nd floor and shouted down to Victor, "Aha! I'm home already!" "Let's stop for a moment on the landing. You're out of breath," said Victor. "My God," said Lyudmila, "just look at the state of the staircase. I'll have to go down tomorrow and get Vasily Ivanovich to have the place cleaned." There they were, husband and wife, standing once more before the door of their home. "Perhaps you'd like to open the door," said Victor. "No, you do it. You're the master of the house." They went inside and walked round all the rooms without taking off their coats. Lyudmila took the telephone receiver off the hook and blew into it and said, "Well, the telephone seems to be working all right." Then she went into the kitchen. "We've even got water, and we could use the lavatory." She went over to the stove and tried to turn on the gas, but it had been cut off. Lord, Lord, it was over at last. The enemy had been halted. They had returned to their home. That Saturday, 21st of June 1941, seemed only yesterday. How much and how little everything had changed. The people who had just entered the house were different. Their hearts were changed. Their lives had changed. They were living in another epoch. Why was everything so ordinary and yet such a source of anxiety? Why did their pre-war life, the life they'd lost, seem so fine and happy? And why was the thought of tomorrow so oppressive? Ration cards, resident permits, the electricity rental, newspaper subscriptions, the state of the lift, and when they were in bed, they would hear that same old clock striking the hour. Following at his wife's heels, Victor suddenly remembered how he and a pretty young Nina had had a drink here in the summer. The empty wine bottle was still beside the sink. He remembered the night after he had read the letter from his mother that had been brought by Colonel Novikov. He remembered his own sudden departure to Chelyabinsk. This was where he'd kissed Nina, where a pin had fallen out of her hair and they hadn't been able to find it. He felt suddenly anxious. What if the pin suddenly turned up? What if she had forgotten her powder puff or her lipstick? Just then the driver came in. Breathing heavily, he looked round the room and asked, "And all this belongs to you?" "Yes," said Victor guiltily. "We've got 8 square metres for the 6 of us," said the driver. "My old woman sleeps during the day when everyone's out at work. During the night, she just sits on a chair." Victor went over to the window. There was Nadia beside their heap of belongings, dancing about and blowing on her fingers. Dear Nadia, dear helpless daughter, this is the house where you were born. The driver brought up a sack of food and a hold-all full of toilet things, and sat down and began rolling himself a cigarette. He seemed quite obsessed with the question of living space. He at once began to regale Victor with stories about the official hygiene recommendations and the bribe takers at the local accommodation bureau. There was a clatter of pans from the kitchen. "Ah, true housewife," said the driver, winking at Victor. Victor looked out of the window again. "A pretty kettle of fish," said the driver. "We'll give the Germans a good thrashing at Stalingrad. People will start coming back to Moscow. It'll be even worse. Not long ago, one of our workers came back to the factory after being wounded twice at the front. His home, of course, had been blown up, so he and his wife moved into some awful cellar. And of course his wife was pregnant and his 2 children had TB, and then the cellar got flooded, and water came right up to their knees. They put wooden boards on top of stools and used them as bridges between the stove, the table and the bed. Then he started making applications. He wrote to the party committee, he wrote to the district committee, he even wrote to Stalin himself. In reply, they just made promises. And then one night, together with his family and all his gear, he moved into a room on the 4th floor that was kept for the district soviet. Then things really did start to happen. He was summoned by the public prosecutor. He was told he must leave the room within 24 hours or he'd get 5 years in a camp and the kids would be packed off to an orphanage. What do you think he did then? Well, he had been decorated at the front, so he stuck his medals onto his chest, right into the flesh, and tried to hang himself in the lunch break, there in the workshop. The other lads at work found him, cut the rope and had him rushed to hospital. He got his flat straight away before he was discharged. Yeah, he did well for himself. It's not spacious, but it's got all they need. Nadia came in, just as he finished. What if the baggage gets stolen? Who will be to blame then? Nadia shrugged, and then went off on a tour of the room, still blowing on her frozen fingers. As soon as Nadia came into the house, Victor felt angry again. You might at least turn your collar down, he said. Nadia paid no attention and shouted towards the kitchen, Mama, I'm terribly hungry. Lyudmila was extraordinarily active that day. Victor thought that if she had deployed this energy at the front, the Germans would already have retreated at least 100 kilometres from Moscow. The plumber turned on the heating. The pipes were still working, even if they weren't very hot. Getting hold of the gas man was more difficult. Lyudmila finally got the director of the gas board to send someone from the emergency brigade. She lit all the burners and placed irons on top of them. The gas was very weak, but they could at least take off their coats now. After the labours of the driver, the plumber and the gas man, the bag of bread had become extremely light. Lyudmila carried on working until late at night. She stuck a rag on the end of a broom and started dusting the walls and ceilings. She cleaned the chandelier, took the dead flowers out to the back staircase, and assembled a huge heap of rags, old papers, and other junk. A grumbling Nadia had to carry 3 bucket loads down to the dustbin. Lyudmila washed all the plates from the kitchen and dining room. She set Victor to dry the knives, forks and plates, but refused to trust him with the tea service. She started doing the washing in the bathroom, thawed out the butter on top of the stove, and sorted through the potatoes they'd brought from Kazan. Victor tried to phone Sokolov. Maria Ivanovna answered. "I've just put Pyotr Laventreevich to bed. He's worn out from the journey, but I can wake him up if it's urgent." No, I just wanted to chat," said Victor. "I'm so happy," said Maria Ivanovna. "I just keep wanting to cry." "Why not come round? Are you doing anything this evening?" "You must be mad. Surely you realise how much Lyudmila and I have to do." She started to ask how long it had taken to get the electricity and the plumbing sorted out, and Victor cut her short. "I'll call Lyudmila. If you want to talk about plumbing, she can continue this discussion." And then he added teasingly, "What a pity you can't come round. We could have read Flaubert's poem, Max and Morris." Ignoring this joke, she said, "I'll phone later. If I've got so much work with just the one room, I can't imagine what it's like for Lyudmila." And Victor realised he had offended her. Suddenly he wished he were back in Kazan. How strange people are. Next, Victor tried to ring Postov, but his phone seemed to be cut off. He tried Gurevich, but was told by his neighbours that he had gone to his sister in Sokolniki. He rang Chepitsin, but no one answered. And suddenly the phone rang. A boyish voice asked for Nadia. She was then on one of her trips to the dustbin. "Who is it?" asked Victor severely. It doesn't matter, just someone she knows." "Victor," called Lyudmila, "you've been chatting long enough on the phone. Come and help me with this cupboard." "I'm not chatting," said Victor. "No one in Moscow wants to speak to me. You might at least give me something to eat. Sokolov's already stuffed himself and gone to bed." Lyudmila seemed only to have increased the chaos in the flat. There were heaps of linen everywhere. The crockery had been taken out of the cupboards and was lying all over the floor. You could hardly move in the rooms and the corridor for all the pans, bowls and sacks. Victor hadn't expected Lyudmila to go into Tolya's room at first, but he was wrong. Looking flushed and anxious, she said to him, "Vitya, put the Chinese vase on Tolya's bookshelf. I've just given the room a good clean." The phone rang again. He heard Nadia answer. "Hello? No, I haven't been out. Mama made me take the rubbish down." "Give me a hand, Vitya," Lyudmila chivied Victor. "Don't just go to sleep. There's still masses to do." A woman's instinct is so simple and so strong. By evening, the chaos was vanquished. The rooms felt warmer and had begun to take on something of their pre-war appearance. They ate supper in the kitchen. Lyudmila had baked some biscuits and fried up some of the millet she had boiled in the afternoon. "Who was that on the phone?" Victor asked Nadia. "Just a boy," said Nadia, burst out laughing. "He's been ringing for 4 days." "What, have you been writing to him?" asked Lyudmila. "Did you tell him we were coming back?" Nadia looked irritated and shrugged her shoulders. "I'd be happy if even a dog phoned me," said Victor. During the night, Victor woke up. Lyudmila was in her nightgown, standing outside Tolya's open door. "Can you see, Tolya?" she was murmuring. "I've managed to clean everything now. Little one, look at your room now. No one would think there'd ever been a war." On their return from evacuation, the university staff met in one of the halls of the Academy of Sciences. All these people, young and old, pale or bald, with large eyes or small piercing eyes, with wide foreheads or narrow foreheads, were conscious, as they came together, of the highest poetry of all, the poetry of prose. Damp sheets and damp pages of books left for too long in unheated rooms, formulae noted down by frozen red fingers, lectures delivered in an overcoat with a collar turned up, salads made from slimy potatoes and a few torn cabbage leaves. The crush to get meal tickets, the tedious thought of having to write your name down for salt fish and an extra ration of oil. All this became suddenly unimportant. As people met, they greeted each other noisily. Victor saw Chepizin standing next to the academician Shishakov. Dmitri Petrovich! Dmitri Petrovich! Victor repeated, looking at the face that was so dear to him, and Chepizin embraced him. Have you heard from your lads at the front? Asked Victor. Yes, they're fine. From the way Chepizin frowned as he said this, Victor realized that he already knew about Tolya's death. Victor Pavlovich, Chepizin went on, give my regards to your wife, my sincerest regards, mine and Nadezhda Fyodorovna's. Then he added, I've read your work. It's interesting, very important, even more than it seems. Yes, it's more interesting than we can yet appreciate. He kissed Victor on the forehead. No, it's nothing, said Victor, feeling embarrassed and happy. On his way to the meeting, he had been wondering stupidly who would have read his work and what they'd say about it. What if no one had read it at all? Now he felt certain that no one would speak of anything else. Shishakov was still standing there. There were lots of things Victor wanted to say, but not in the presence of a third party, and certainly not in the presence of Shishakov. When he looked at Shishakov, Victor was always reminded of Gleb Uspensky's phrase, a pyramid-shaped buffalo. His square, fleshy face, his arrogant, equally fleshy lips, his pudgy fingers with their polished nails, his thick silver-grey crew-cut, all somehow oppressed Victor. Every time he met Shishakov, he caught himself thinking, will he recognise me? Will he say hello? He'd then feel angry with himself for feeling glad when Shishakov's fleshy lips slowly pronounced a few words that somehow seemed equally fleshy. The arrogant bull, Victor once said to Sokolov when Shishakov was mentioned. He makes me feel like a Jew in a shtetl in the presence of a cavalry colonel. Just think, said Sokolov, what he's most famous for is failing to recognise a positron on a photograph. All the research students know the story. They call it Academician Shishakov's mistake. Sokolov very rarely spoke ill of people, whether from caution or from some pious principle that forbade him to judge his neighbours. But Shishakov irritated him beyond endurance. Sokolov couldn't help but ridicule and abuse him. They began to talk about the war. The German advance has been halted on the Volga, said Chepizin. There's the power of the Volga for you. Living water, living power. Stalingrad, said Shishakov. The triumph of our strategy and the determination of our people. Alexey Alexeyevich, are you acquainted with Victor Pavlovich's latest work? Chepizin asked suddenly. I know of it, of course, but I haven't read it yet. It was by no means clear from Shishakov's face whether he really had heard of it. Victor looked for a long time into Chepizin's eyes. He wanted his old friend and teacher to see all he had been through, all his doubts and losses. But he saw sadness, depression, and the weariness of old age on Chepizin's face too. Sokolov came up. Chepizin shook him by the hand, but Shishakov merely glanced carelessly at his rather old jacket. Then Postoyev joined them, and Shishakov's large, fleshy face broke into a smile. Greetings, my friend. Now you're someone I really am glad to see. They asked after each other's health, and after their wives and children, and as they talked about their dachas, they sounded like grand lords. How are you getting on? Victor asked Sokolov quietly. Is it warm in your flat? It's not yet any better than Kazan, answered Sokolov. Masha said I must give you her regards. She'll probably come round and see you tomorrow. Splendid. We miss her. In Kazan we got used to seeing her every day. Every day? It seemed more like 3 times a day. I even suggested she move in with you. Victor laughed, but was conscious of something false in his laughter. Then academician Leontriev entered the hall, a mathematician with a big nose, an imposing bald skull, and enormous glasses with yellow frames. Once, when they'd both been staying in Gaspre, they'd gone on a trip together to Yalta. They'd drunk a lot of wine in a shop and staggered back to the canteen in Gaspre singing a dirty song, and this had alarmed the staff and amused the other holidaymakers. Seeing Victor, Leontiev smiled. Victor lowered his eyes, expecting Leontiev to say something about his work. Instead, Leontiev seemed to be remembering their adventures at Gaspre. With a wave of the hand he called out, "Well, Victor Pavlovich, how about a song?" A young man with dark hair came in. He was wearing a black suit. Victor noticed that Shishakov greeted him immediately. Suslakov also approached the young man. Suslakov was an important man on the Presidium, though the exact nature of his duties was rather obscure. But if you needed a flat, or if a lecturer needed to get from Almaty to Kazan, then Suslakov could be more useful than the president himself. He had the tired face of a man who works at night, and his cheeks seemed to have been kneaded from grey dough. He was the sort of man who's needed by everyone all the time. They were all accustomed to the way Suslakov smoked Palmyra at meetings, while the academician smoked ordinary tobacco or shag. And he didn't get lifts home from some celebrity. No, he'd offer the celebrities a ride in his Ziz. Victor watched the conversation between Suslakov and the young man with dark hair. He could tell that it wasn't the young man who was asking a favour of Suslakov. However gracefully a man asks for a favour, you can always tell who's asking and who is being asked. On the contrary, the young man seemed quite ready to break off the conversation, and he greeted Chepizin coolly with studied politeness. "By the way, who is that young grandee?" asked Victor. In a low voice, Postoyev answered, "He's been working for a while in the scientific section of the Central Committee." "Do you know," said Victor, "I've got an extraordinary feeling, as though our determination at Stalingrad is the determination of Newton, the determination of Einstein, as though our victory on the Volga symbolises the triumph of Einstein's ideas. Well, you know what I mean?" Shishakov gave a perplexed smile, gently shook his head. "Don't you understand me, Alexei Alexeyevich?" said Victor. "It's as clear as mud," said the young man from the scientific section, who was now standing beside Victor. "But I suppose the so-called theory of relativity can allow one to establish a link between the Russian Volga and Albert Einstein." "Why so called?" asked Victor in astonishment. He turned to the pyramid-shaped Shishakov for support, but Shishakov's quiet contempt seemed to extend to Einstein as well. Victor felt a rush of anger. This was the way it sometimes happened. Something would needle him, and he'd find it very difficult to restrain himself. At home in the evening, he'd finally allow himself to reply. Sometimes he quite forgot himself, shouting and gesticulating, standing up for what he loved and ridiculing his enemies. "Papa's making a speech again," Lyudmila would say to Nadia. This time, it wasn't only on Einstein's behalf that he was angry. Everyone he knew should be talking about his work. He himself should be the centre of attention. He felt upset and hurt. He knew it was ridiculous to take offence like that, but he did. No one but Chepizin had spoken to him about his work. He began rather timidly to explain. "The fascists have exiled the brilliant Einstein, and their physics has become the physics of monkeys. But we, thank God, have halted the advance of fascism. It all goes together. The Volga, Stalingrad, Albert Einstein, the greatest genius of our epoch, the most remote little village, an illiterate old peasant woman, and the freedom we all need. This all goes together. I may sound confused, but perhaps there isn't anything clearer than this confusion. I think Viktor Pavlovich, that your panegyric to Einstein is a trifle exaggerated," said Chichikov. "Yes," said Pustoyev lightly. "On the whole, I would say the same." The young man from the scientific section just looked at Viktor sadly. "Well, Comrade Strum," he began, and Viktor once again felt the malevolence in his voice. "To you it may seem natural, at a time of such importance for our people, to couple Albert Einstein and the Volga. These days, however, have awoken other sentiments in the hearts of those who disagree with you. Still, no one has power over someone else's heart, and there's nothing to argue about there. But there is room for argument as regards your evaluation of Einstein. It does seem inappropriate to regard an idealist theory as the peak of scientific achievement." "That's enough," Viktor interrupted. "Alexey Alexeyevich," he went on in an arrogant and didactic voice, "contemporary physics without Einstein is a physics of monkeys. It's not for us to trifle with the names of Einstein, Galileo, and Newton." He raised a finger to silence Chichikov and saw him blink. A minute later, Viktor was standing by the window and recounting this unexpected incident to Sokolov, partly in a whisper and partly quite loudly. "And you were right next to me, and you didn't even hear. Chepizin suddenly disappeared too. It was almost as though he did so on purpose." He frowned and fell silent. How childishly, how naively he had looked forward to today's triumph. As it turned out, it had been some young bureaucrat who had created the most stir. "Do you know the name of the young grandee?" Sokolov asked suddenly, as though reading Viktor's thoughts. "Do you realize whose relative he is?" "I've no idea." Sokolov leant over and whispered in Viktor's ear. "You don't say!" exclaimed Viktor. He remembered the way both Suslakov and Chichikov had deferred to this youth. "Oh," he said. "So that's what it's all about. Now I understand." Sokolov laughed. "Well, you've already established a cordial relationship with the scientific section and the higher echelons of the academy. You're like the Mark Twain hero who boasts about his income to the tax inspector." Viktor didn't appreciate this witticism. "You were standing right beside me," he replied. "Did you not really hear our argument? Or did you prefer not to get involved in my conversation with the tax inspector?" Sokolov smiled. His small eyes looked suddenly kind and beautiful. "Don't be upset, Viktor Pavlovich. Surely you didn't really expect Chichikov to appreciate your work. My God, what a lot of nonsense all this is. But your work's different. That's real." In his eyes and voice, Viktor sensed the warmth and seriousness he had hoped to find that autumn evening in Kazan. The meeting began. The speakers talked about the task of science during this difficult time, and about their own readiness to devote their strength to the popular cause and to help the army in its struggle against German fascism. They spoke about the work of the various institutes of the Academy, about the assistance that would be given to scientists by the Central Committee of the party, about how Comrade Stalin, the leader of the army and the people, still had time to concern himself with scientific questions, about the duty of every scientist to justify the trust placed in him by the party and by Comrade Stalin himself. There was also mention of some organisational changes occasioned by the new setup. The physicists learned with surprise that they themselves were dissatisfied with the projects of their institute. Too much attention, apparently, was being given to purely theoretical matters. Suslakov's words, "The institute is cut off from life," were whispered around the hall.